Rowan Dunbar had not spoken in 4 minutes. He sat on his horse at the gate of a small ranch on the Powder River holding a lead rope attached to 8 bulls, and he could not find the words for what he had come to say. 5 months ago, he had stood on this same ground and called the structure behind the gate an expensive coffin for sheep. He had said it loudly in front of his foreman and a journalist, and the words had traveled across the territory in saddlebags and mail pouches until every rancher from Casper to Sheridan had heard them and laughed. Now he was back. The 8 bulls behind him were all that remained of 4,000 head of cattle. The rest were dead on the open range, frozen where they stood buried under snow so deep that it would take 50 men working through the spring just to count and burn the carcasses. And the structure he had mocked the barn with the ridiculous wool-packed walls was breathing. Warm vapor rose from the seams of the door frame and curled into the frozen air like smoke from a chimney, except there was no chimney. There was no fire of any kind inside those walls. There was only wool and the body heat of animals, and somehow that was enough. Dunbar opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. The woman who owned this place was standing 30 feet away watching him from the barn door, and her expression carried neither triumph nor pity. She was simply waiting for him to say what he had come to say, the way a person waits for weather. "Mrs. Treadwell," he finally managed, "I do not know how to ask this." She already knew. She had known since the moment she saw him coming across the white prairie with his last 8 bulls. She opened the gate without another word. But that moment was the end of a story that had begun 18 months earlier, in a different season, when a widow from Minnesota stepped off a freight wagon into the most beautiful and terrifying landscape she had ever seen. Eulah Treadwell arrived in the Powder River country in the spring of 1885, carrying a Sami wool comb, a leather satchel of seeds, and a quiet determination that her neighbors would mistake for foreign stubbornness for nearly 2 full years. She was 34 years old. She had been a widow for 13 months. And she had crossed 2 oceans and half a continent to claim 60 acres of grazing land on the strength of nothing more than a homestead certificate and the conviction that what had kept her family alive on the Finnmark Plateau would keep her alive in Wyoming. Her husband Anders had died of pneumonia in the Minnesota winter of 1884, leaving her with a small inheritance and a household that dissolved within 6 months. Anders' sister had remarried quickly, and the new husband had made it quietly but unmistakably clear that there was no longer room in the cabin for an extra woman. So Eulah had taken her share of the savings, sold the milk cow, and bought passage on the Northern Pacific Railroad and as far as Miles City. From there, she arranged a freight wagon to carry her and her possessions south into the territory where land was still being given away to anyone willing to break it. Before she left Minnesota, a letter arrived from Anders's parents. They were sending Emery Anders's 16-year-old son from his first marriage to live with her by autumn. "The boy has no one else," the letter said. "We are too old. His mother's people will not take him. You are the only option remaining." Eulah had not spent much time with Emery. The boy had lived with his grandparents since his own mother died in childbirth, and he had always regarded Eulah as the foreign woman his father had married late in life, a replacement he had never asked for and did not particularly want. But Anders had asked her to promise in the last coherent conversation they ever had that she would look after the boy if something happened. She had promised, and Eulah Treadwell kept her promises the way she kept her livestock completely. She folded the letter and put it in the leather satchel with the seeds and did not think about it again until the boy actually arrived. The country she found in Wyoming was beautiful in a way that frightened her. The grass ran to the horizon in waves of blue and green, and the sky pressed down with a weight she had never experienced in the close valleys of her childhood. There were no trees worth speaking of, no neighbors within shouting distance, and no protection of any kind from a wind that seemed to begin somewhere in the Bighorn Mountains and stop only when it reached the Mississippi. She staked her claim along a small creek that ran year-round, built a sod dugout for her first summer, and began the slow work of learning what this country would and would not give her. By the autumn of 1885, she had purchased a small flock of 40 sheep from a Basque herder who was leaving the territory for California, along with 2 milk cows, a dozen chickens, and a mule named Corbin that she had paid too much for and would never regret owning. The sheep were the foundation of her plan, though nobody around her understood this yet. Wyoming in 1885 was cattle country, and cattle country meant open range. And open range meant that any rancher worth his salt drove his herd onto public grass in May and left them there until October, then either shipped them to the railhead at Cheyenne or turned them loose for the winter to fend for themselves on whatever grass they could paw out from beneath the snow. The whole economy of the territory rested on the assumption that range cattle were tough enough to survive without shelter, and that any rancher who wasted lumber-building barns for a stock was either a fool or a sentimentalist who had not learned how the West had actually worked. Eulah had grown up differently. Her grandmother on her mother's side had been Sami, born among the reindeer herders of the Finnmark Plateau, where winter ran from October through May, and temperatures regularly fell below 40 below for weeks at a time. Eulah had spent her childhood summers at her grandmother's gamo, the traditional winter dwelling, learning the careful science of how a people survived in a place where cold was not an event but a condition, a permanent fact of existence that could not be fought with brute force. The Sami did not build enormous fires and pile on furs and hope to outlast the cold through sheer combustion of fuel. They had learned across 1,000 years of trial and death and refinement to work with the physics of trapped air and fibrous insulation, to understand that the difference between life and death in a Finnmark blizzard was not how much heat you could generate, but how little heat you could afford to lose. And the foundation of everything they knew about staying warm was wool. Not just any wool, the raw, greasy fleece that came off a sheep before any washing or carding. Fleece still saturated with lanolin. Fleece in which the natural crimp of each fiber created billions of tiny air pockets that no other material on Earth could match. The fiber was hollow. It trapped air. It absorbed moisture without losing its insulating power. It would not burn easily, would not rot quickly, would not pack down flat the way straw or sawdust eventually did. A pound of wool properly placed was worth 10 pounds of any other material humans had ever invented for keeping cold at bay. Eulah remembered the summer she was 9 years old, standing inside her grandmother's gamo, while the old woman pressed Eulah's small hand against the wall. The wall was soft and warm, packed tight with raw fleece between inner and outer skins. Her grandmother pushed Eulah's hand in gently and watched how the wool responded. "If it gives a little and springs back," her grandmother said, "the density is right. If your hand sinks deep without resistance, there is not enough wool. If the surface feels hard and will not yield, you have packed it too tight and killed the air inside." Then she lifted Eulah's hand away and watched the wool slowly return to its original shape. "Wool is the only material that remembers how to insulate even when it is wet," she said. "The Almighty designed it specifically for that purpose. Do not ever forget this." Eulah had carried that knowledge across the Atlantic and across the continent. When she stood on her Wyoming claim that first autumn and felt the wind cut through her coat as if the fabric were not there, she knew immediately that any structure she built for her animals would have to follow the principles her grandmother had taught her. There was simply no other way. The cottonwood logs available for construction were soft and porous and chinked poorly. Sod worked for a small dugout, but could not serve for a livestock barn that needed proper ventilation and dry footing. And the standard cattleman's approach, which was no shelter at all, would mean watching her sheep freeze to death the first time the temperature dropped below 30 below. So Eulah built differently. She began in the spring of 1886 as soon as the ground had thawed enough to dig post holes, and she worked through every dry day for the next 7 months. She laid out the foundation as a rectangle 30 feet by 20 with stone footings dug 4 feet into the ground to prevent frost heave. She framed the walls with double rows of cottonwood studs, an outer row and an inner row separated by an 8-inch cavity with horizontal blocking every 4 feet to keep the cavity stable. The roof was a low-pitched shed style, just steep enough to shed snow, with deep eaves and a continuous ridge vent disguised as a simple capboard. She built each door as a sandwich of inner and outer plank skins separated by a 4-inch core of wool batting, and she fitted each door with a wool felt gasket that compressed when the door closed, sealing the opening tight against drafts. She built a small vestibule at the main entrance, 6 feet by 4 with 2 sets of doors, so that cold air could never penetrate directly into the main barn space. The floor received particular attention. She laid a base of broken stone for drainage, then a layer of wool felt 3 inches thick, then heavy planks on floor joists, then straw bedding on top. The total floor assembly measured nearly 14 inches from frozen ground to the surface where her sheep would stand. The whole framework was conventional enough that nobody questioned it during the early phases. But as summer progressed and Eulah began filling that 8-inch wall cavity, the questions started. She drove her wagon into the small settlement of Crooked Creek twice a month through June and July, returning each time with a load of raw fleece purchased from the Wyoming Wool Growers Cooperative. The cooperative had a warehouse at the railhead where unsold fleece accumulated during shearing season, and Eulah had negotiated a price of 3 cents per pound for the lower grades that were difficult to ship east. She bought 400 pounds the first month, another 400 the second, and by the end of July, she had nearly 1,200 pounds of greasy, unwashed wool stacked around her construction site. She tamped each handful into the wall cavity with a flat wooden paddle she had made herself, pressing and packing until the wool achieved the density her grandmother had taught her to recognize by touch, not too loose, or it would settle over time and leave cold gaps. Not too tight, or the compressed fibers would lose the very air pockets that gave them their insulating value. She checked every section of every wall by hand before nailing up the inner sheathing, and she lined every corner, every door frame, every window opening, every place where 2 pieces of wood met with strips of dense wool felt she had made by wetting fleece, agitating it with hot water and pressing it between boards until the fibers matted together. Hollis Ludlow was the first neighbor to express his opinion, and he expressed it loudly. Ludlow ran 400 head of cattle on the range north of Eulah's claim, and he considered himself the unofficial spokesman for proper ranching practice in the area. He had spent 6 winters on the high plains without losing more than a quarter of his stock to weather, and he regarded this record as proof that the open range system was fundamentally sound, and that anyone who deviated from it was either ignorant or insane. He rode over to Eulah's place in late July, sat his horse for 10 minutes, watching her tamp wool into the barn cavity, and finally called down to her with the tone of a man who could no longer contain his amazement. "Mrs. Treadwell, what in the name of all that is holy do you think you are doing with that wool?" Eulah wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist and looked up at him without stopping her work. "I am building walls, Mr. Ludlow. The cavity needs filling, and wool fills it well." "Wool is for shipping," Ludlow said. "Wool is money. You stuff that into your walls, and the mice will nest in it by Christmas, and the moths will breed in it by spring. You will have wasted $300 on something that any sensible woman would have sold to the buyers at Cheyenne. The wool I am buying is the off-grade fleece, Eulah said. The buyers at Cheyenne will not pay for it. The cooperative is glad to sell it to me at 3 cents because otherwise it sits in the warehouse until the rats get it. Ludlow waved this off. The point is that animals do not need this kind of pampering. My cattle have wintered on this range for 6 years. They eat snow when there is no water. They paw down to grass under 3 feet of drift. They are tough animals, Mrs. Treadwell. Tough animals need a windbreak in good range, in the good Lord's mercy, and that has been enough for every rancher between here and the Yellowstone. Eulah did not argue. She had learned in Minnesota that arguing with American men about animal husbandry was a waste of breath, particularly when the men had spent only a handful of years on the land and considered themselves experts already. She nodded politely, returned to her work, and continued building exactly as her grandmother had taught her. That evening, alone in her dugout, she opened the leather-bound ledger she had kept since Minnesota and wrote by lamplight. Ludlow says his cattle have survived 6 winters, but 6 mild winters proved nothing. Grandmother said the real winter only needs to come once. She closed the ledger and blew out the lamp and listened to the wind testing the prairie outside. Eulah Treadwell arrived on a freight wagon in the middle of August carrying a single trunk and an expression that suggested he had already decided this arrangement was temporary. He was 16 thin in the way that boys are thin when they have grown 6 inches in a year and their bodies have not yet caught up, and he addressed Eulah as Mrs. Treadwell with a formality that was not politeness but distance. He stood in the yard and looked at the half-finished barn and at the piles of raw wool and at the woman who was supposedly responsible for him, and the first thing he said was, "My father would never have done this." Eulah studied him for a moment. She saw Anders in his jaw and in the set of his shoulders, and she felt something complicated move through her chest. "Help me with the far corner," she said, and held out the wooden paddle. Emery did not take it. He turned and walked toward the creek without another word. Over the following weeks, a pattern established itself. Emery refused to work on the barn. He spent his days riding over to Hollis Ludlow's ranch, where the men treated him with rough kindness and taught him to count cattle from horseback, and showed him what they called the real work of the territory. Ludlow gave the boy his first cowboy hat and told him stories about the open range that made it sound like the only honest way a man could live. Emery came home in the evening smelling like horses and leather and spoke to Eulah only when necessary. He was not cruel, he was simply absent, and the absence was its own kind of cruelty, though Eulah understood that the boy did not mean it that way. He was 16 and fatherless and living with a woman he had not chosen in a place he had not chosen, and the only people who showed him warmth were the same people who laughed at his stepmother every time she drove her wagon through town with another load of raw wool. The second blow came from a direction Eulah had not anticipated. Reverend Orrin Whitmore rode up to her property on a Sunday afternoon in late August. Whitmore was the only minister within 50 miles, a lean man of about 52, with careful eyes and a voice trained for pulpits, and he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being the moral center of a community. He dismounted, accepted a cup of water, and walked around the barn for several minutes, examining the wool-packed walls with an expression that was not quite disapproval, but was certainly not approval either. "Mrs. Treadwell," he said, "I have heard about your methods. I understand you learned them from the Lapp people in the old country." Eulah felt the word land like a small stone. Lapp was the term outsiders used for the Sami, and it carried a weight of condescension that Whitmore may or may not have intended. "From my grandmother," she said simply. Whitmore nodded. I do not presume to judge your quietness, but I want to share something with you as your pastor, if I may. The people of this territory have built their livelihoods on the understanding that the Lord provides for his creatures. Cattle are strong. Sheep carry wool on their backs for a reason. When we go beyond what is natural, when we pamper livestock, beyond the provisions the Almighty has already made, we may be expressing a lack of trust in his design. Eulah felt the blood rise in her face. Not anger exactly, but something close to it. Something that burned at the edges. Every cattleman who had laughed at her had laughed at the method. Whitmore was not laughing at the method. He was questioning the source. He was suggesting that the knowledge her grandmother had carried from the Finnmark Plateau, knowledge refined across 1,000 years of survival, was somehow a failure of faith. Reverend, she said, and her voice was steady, even though her hands were not. My grandmother believed in God. She believed he created wool specifically so that people and animals could survive in places where survival should not have been possible. She considered it a sin to waste what he had provided. Whitmore smiled. It was the smile of a man who has heard a child say something clever, but ultimately beside the point. He touched the brim of his hat, mounted his horse, and rode away. The damage from Whitmore's visit was not immediate. It was structural. His words moved through the community the way water moves through a crack in stone, slowly and in every direction. Within 2 weeks, the general opinion at Crooked Creek had shifted from amused contempt for Eulah's wool walls to something more serious. She was no longer merely eccentric. She was a foreign woman with foreign methods that might represent a foreign way of thinking about God's creation. Emery heard the talk. He heard it at Ludlow's ranch and at the Mercantile and in the casual conversations that men had when they thought no one was listening. And one evening in September, he came back from Ludlow's place and stood in the door of the dugout and said the words that Eulah had been dreading since the day he arrived. You are making us a joke. Every person in this territory is laughing at us. My father was an American. He would be ashamed to see you stuffing wool into walls like a lap. Eulah looked at him. She saw Anders's jaw and Anders's shoulders and heard a voice that was Anders's voice, twisted into a shape Anders would never have given it. She did not answer. She walked past him down to the creek and stood alone on the bank in the long September light. And for the first time since she had come to Wyoming, she wept. Not because Emery was right, not because she doubted her grandmother, but because she heard her dead husband in every syllable the boy spoke, and the distance between what Anders had been and what his son was becoming felt like a canyon opening in the ground beneath her. That night, she wrote in her ledger, if Anders were alive, he would understand. But Anders is gone, and his son does not yet know what he does not know. Rowan Dunbar came in the second week of September with 2 of his foremen and a young journalist named Tansy Renfield, who happened to be visiting his ranch from the Cheyenne Tribune. Dunbar was the largest cattleman in the Powder River Basin, running 4,000 head, across a range so vast that it took 3 days to ride from one boundary to the other, and he had made the trip specifically to see the structure that everyone in the territory was talking about. He examined Eulah's barn for the better part of an hour, asking pointed questions about the construction and the cost, and then he delivered his assessment with the confidence of a man who had absolutely no idea that his words would be read aloud at his own funeral 5 months later. Mrs. Treadwell, Dunbar said, you have built yourself a very expensive coffin for sheep. Sheep are the dumbest animals God ever created. They do not need barns. They need range. And cattle need range even more. You have spent more money on this one structure than most ranchers spend on their entire operation. And when the first hard winter comes, you will discover that all the wool in Wyoming cannot save an animal that has been pampered out of its natural toughness. Tansy Renfield wrote everything down. She was 28, one of the very few women working as journalists in the territory, and she had been assigned to write a color piece about ranch life in the Powder River country. Dunbar's quote was too good to leave out. After Dunbar and his foreman departed, Tansy lingered. She stood with Eulah at the barn door and asked questions that were different from Dunbar's. Questions that were not designed to confirm something she already believed, but to understand something she did not. Mrs. Treadwell, Tansy said, I am going to write this story. I want to be honest with you. My editor wants it entertaining. He wants the angle about the unusual immigrant woman, not the angle about insulation science. If I write it the way he wants it, will not be entirely fair to you. Eulah looked at her and saw something she recognized. A woman caught between what she knew was true and what the men around her would allow her to say. Write what you need to write, Eulah said. The wool does not need anyone to believe in it in order to work. Tansy nodded slowly. 2 weeks later, the Cheyenne Tribune published a piece under the headline, Norwegian Widow Builds Sheep Hotel on Powder River. The article was not openly cruel, but it was amused in the way that a cat is amused by something small and helpless, and copies of it traveled across the territory until nearly every rancher between Casper and Sheridan had an opinion about the strange wool barn and the foreign woman who built it. The opinions were uniformly negative. There was one man who did not laugh. Reuben Josias Pemberton was a northern Cheyenne man who lived with his wife and 2 children on a parcel of allotted land 6 miles south of Eulah's claim. He raised horses and a small herd of cattle and worked seasonally as a freighter between Crooked Creek and the agency. He had ridden past Eulah's place several times during the summer construction, and unlike the white ranchers who mocked the wool walls, Pemberton had simply watched and said nothing. In late September, he stopped at the barn while Eulah was installing the last of the interior fittings. He stood inside the empty stable for a long time, examining the walls and ceiling and floor with the careful attention of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at. He pressed his hand flat against the inner sheathing and held it there, feeling the warmth that the wool trapped even on a cool autumn day. This is built well, he said in the slightly formal English he had learned at the agency school. My grandmother's people, when they made winter lodges, they used buffalo robes the same way you have used the wool. 2 skins with grass between them. The grass made the air still. The still air kept the heat. He paused. The wool will be better than grass. Grass packs down. Wool does not pack down so much, and the wool has the oil in it, the oil from the sheep that keeps the water out. Eulah felt something loosen in her chest that she had not realized had been tight for months. Yes, she said, the lanolin. My grandmother said wool was the only material that remembered how to insulate even when it was wet. Pemberton smiled slightly. Your grandmother and my grandmother would have understood each other. Then he looked toward the open range where Hollis Ludlow's distant cattle grazed a mile away. The men who run those cattle, he said, they do not understand cold. They understand only summer. When the bad winter comes, they will learn. He paused again and his face changed. My father lost 200 horses in the winter of 1862, he said. The Indian Bureau forbade our people from building lodges the old way, made us use the white man's log houses. The log houses could not hold heat the way our lodges did. The horses died. They said it was God's will. Eulah heard the echo of Whitmore's words in that last sentence and felt something cold settle in her stomach. The same argument, the same result. Different century, different people, same refusal to listen. Pemberton was the only person in the territory who told her that her work made sense, and she found that this single voice of recognition was enough to sustain her through the continuing mockery of everyone else. Linnea Brogan came in October with a jar of preserved peaches and a gentle warning. Linnea was the wife of a small rancher named Colton, who lived 12 miles east, and she was the closest thing Eulah had to a friend in the territory. She toured the finished barn with genuine interest and then said as carefully as she could, "Eulah, dear, my husband says you have been ill-advised. We have been on this range 8 years now, and we have never lost an animal because we did not stuff our walls with wool. The Lord made sheep with wool on their backs already. They do not need it on their walls too." Then she added more quietly, "And Eulah, I must tell you, Emery came to our place last week. The boy is unhappy. He says he is ashamed." Eulah thanked her for the peaches and the honesty and offered no defense. That night, lying in the loft she had built above the barn's tack room, listening to the wind find every seam in the roof and fail to penetrate any of them, Eulah allowed herself for the first time to consider the possibility that she was wrong. She opened her ledger and wrote by lamplight, "If this winter is mild, if the cold does not come the way grandmother described, then everyone is right, and I have wasted everything. The money, the months of labor, and whatever chance I had of making Emery see me as something other than the foreign woman who built a hotel for sheep." She lay in the dark for a long time after that, feeling the doubt work through her, the way Whitmore's words had worked through the community. Then she remembered her grandmother's hand pressing hers against the wool wall of the gamo, and she remembered the old woman's voice saying, "This is not about believing the wool will work. This is about knowing it will work." Believing and knowing are two different things. Eulah chose knowing. She closed the ledger and listened to the wind push against the wool walls and felt the walls push back steady and warm and silent. The walls did not shudder, they did not flex. They held. The first snow fell on the 18th of October, light and dry, melting by midday. The second came on the 24th and stayed. By the first week of November, the temperature was dropping below 20 degrees at night, and Eulah moved all her animals into the wool barn for the winter. The 40 sheep, the 2 milk cows, Corbin the mule, and a small flock of chickens in a separate enclosure within the structure. They settled into their assigned areas with the calm of animals who recognized that they had been brought to a good place. Emery came back from Ludlow's ranch on a gray afternoon in early November, his coat inadequate and his face raw from the wind, and said without looking at her, "I will stay through the winter. Not because I believe you are right, because I have nowhere else to go." Eulah nodded. "The spare bed is in the loft, ladder on the left. No embrace, no warmth beyond the words." He climbed the ladder and lay down on the straw mattress she had prepared weeks ago, knowing he would eventually come, and he fell asleep without saying goodnight. Eulah lay awake for a long time, listening to the boy's breathings settle into the rhythm of sleep, layered with the slow breathing of 40 sheep and 2 cows and a mule in the space below. She opened her ledger one last time and wrote, "He is here now. All I need is time." She closed the book and blew out the lamp. Outside, the temperature was falling. The first real test of the wool walls was 3 days away, and neither Eulah nor anyone else in the Powder River country had any idea what was coming. The sound that woke Eulah on the night of November 12th was not wind. It was silence, a silence so total and so heavy that it pressed against the wool walls like a living thing, and she lay in the loft for several seconds with her eyes open in the dark, trying to understand what had changed. Then she realized the wind had stopped. For the first time in weeks, the air outside was perfectly still, and in that stillness, the cold had descended with a weight that she could feel through the roof boards above her head. She dressed quickly, pulled on her boots, and climbed down the ladder with her lantern. The animals below were quiet, not the restless quiet of creatures sensing danger, but the deep, settled quiet of warmth. The sheep lay in their straw with their legs folded beneath them, breathing slowly. The two cows stood side by side near the hayrack, chewing with the mechanical patience of animals who had no reason to hurry. Corbin the mule was asleep, standing up, one ear forward, one ear back, dreaming of whatever mules dream of when they are warm and fed and safe. Eulah walked to the barn door, opened the outer vestibule, and stepped into the space between the two sets of doors. Even here in the buffer zone, the air was noticeably cooler. She opened the outer door and the cold hit her face like a fist. She held the lantern up to the thermometer she had mounted at eye level on the doorframe and read the mercury, 17 degrees below zero. She stepped back inside, closed both doors carefully, and walked to the interior thermometer mounted on the opposite wall at the same height, 34 degrees above zero. 51 degrees of difference, no fire, no stove, no fuel of any kind. Just the body heat of 40 sheep and 2 cows and 1 mule, trapped inside 8 inches of raw wool, held there by the physics her grandmother had understood and the construction Eulah had spent 7 months completing. She stood in the center of the stable and laughed. It came out of her before she could stop it. A real laugh, the first sound of genuine joy she had made since Anders died. It echoed off the wool-packed walls, and the sheep lifted their heads briefly and then lowered them again unconcerned. Above her, the loft boards creaked. Emery's face appeared at the edge, lit from below by the lantern, squinting down at her with the irritated expression of a boy pulled from sleep. "What are you laughing at?" Eulah pointed at the 2 thermometers. 51 degrees, she said, no fire. Emery stared at the thermometers. He looked at the sheep breathing peacefully in their straw. He looked at the frost forming on the outside of the doorframe and at the complete absence of frost on the inside. He did not say anything sarcastic. He did not say anything at all. He simply looked, and then he pulled his head back into the loft and lay down again. Eulah stood alone among her animals for another minute, holding the lantern, listening to the silence of a barn that was doing exactly what she had built it to do. 3 miles north, Hollis Ludlow's 400 cattle stood on the open prairie in 17 below zero with nothing between them and the sky. She opened her ledger and wrote the numbers. Outside, -17. Inside, +34. Differential was 1. Then she added 2 more words beneath them underlined, "once it works." The days that followed settled into a rhythm defined by the animals and the cold. Eulah woke each morning before dawn, descended the ladder and began the circuit that would occupy her until dark, forking hay into the feeding racks, breaking the thin skin of ice that formed overnight on the water trough. Despite the barn's warmth mucking the stalls into a wheelbarrow, she emptied into a composting pile behind the south wall, checking each sheep for signs of foot rot or respiratory distress, examining the ventilation ridge from below for any accumulation of frost that might block the airflow the barn depended on to prevent moisture buildup. The ridge vent was her grandmother's most important lesson. Without it, the animal's breath would condense on the cold interior surfaces and soak the wool in the walls, and wet wool lost its ability to trap still air. The vent allowed moisture to escape upward, while the warm air, being lighter than the cold air above, rose only as far as the insulated roof and settled back down. It was a balance, and Eulah checked it every morning the way a sailor checks the rigging. What surprised her was Emery. The boy who had refused to touch the wooden paddle in August began in the second week of November to help with the daily temperature readings. She did not ask him to. She did not suggest it. She simply left the ledger open on the hay bale near the ladder each evening, and one morning she came down and found the dawn entry already recorded in his handwriting. The snow had made travel to Ludlow's ranch first difficult and then impossible. The trail broke apart in the third week of November when a heavy fall buried the fence posts that served as markers And without those posts, a rider could wander into a coulee and freeze before finding the way back. Emery stopped trying to leave. He was trapped and he knew it, and for the first 3 days of that confinement, he sat in the loft and stared at the ceiling with the particular misery of a young person who believes he has been imprisoned by circumstances rather than by weather. But a 16-year-old boy surrounded by living animals will eventually reach for something to do, and the ledger was there, and the thermometers were there, and the act of recording numbers required no conversation with the woman. He was not yet ready to forgive for being alive when his father was not. Emery took over the dawn and midnight readings entirely by the end of November, carrying the lantern down the ladder 4 times a day, recording the numbers in Eulah's ledger with the careful handwriting of a boy who had been educated at a church school in Minnesota. He did not speak to her during these readings. He simply wrote the numbers and climbed back up. But Eulah noticed that he had begun to linger at the bottom of the ladder after the midnight reading, standing in the warm darkness among the sleeping animals, listening to the breathing that filled the barn like a slow tide. She never spoke to him during these moments. She pretended to be asleep. And she wondered whether the boy was beginning to understand that the warmth surrounding him was not an accident but a decision, and that the decision had been made by someone whose judgment he had refused to trust. After 2 weeks, he noticed the pattern. The differential held steady regardless of what happened outside. When the temperature dropped to 10 below, the inside stayed near 40 above. When it fell to 20 below, the inside settled around 32. The gap was always between 45 and 55 degrees, as reliable as a heartbeat. One morning, after recording a reading of -23 outside and +29 inside, he set the ledger down and looked at Eulah across the hay rack. "Why does it always hold at about 50 degrees? Eulah did not explain. She had made a promise to herself that she would show rather than tell, because telling had never worked with anyone in this territory, and she did not expect it to work with a 16-year-old boy who had spent the autumn being taught by Hollis Ludlow that real ranchers did not need walls. Instead, she walked him to the interior wall and placed his palm flat against the pine sheathing. "Feel that," she said. "Warm," he said. She led him through the vestibule and placed his palm against the outer sheathing. He pulled his hand back and almost immediately. 8 inches between them, Eulah said. "That is all." She went back inside and resumed forking hay. Emery stood at the outer wall for a moment longer, looking at his hand, and then followed her in without speaking. Josias Pemberton arrived in the 3rd week of November with a wagon load of hay that Eulah had purchased from him in October. He spent an hour inside the barn, moving slowly from section to section, checking the animals and the structure with the thoroughness of a man who builds things himself and recognizes quality construction when he sees it. He tested the ventilation by holding a strip of cloth near the ridge vent and watching the gentle draw of air upward. He examined the door gaskets. He pressed his boot against the floor and felt the solidity of the stone and felt and plank assembly beneath the straw. When he finally came back out into the cold, he stood with his hand on the door frame and said, "Mrs. Treadwell, your sheep are warmer in there than I am in my own house." "They are," Eulah said. "I think I will bring my children over sometime to see this. They should know that walls can be built this way." Then his expression changed. He lowered his voice, though there was no one within miles to overhear. "I need to tell you something. Rowan Dunbar is talking at Crooked Creek. He says that if this winter passes without serious losses on the open range, he will petition the Territorial Council to prohibit what he calls foreign construction methods on public land. He is telling people your barn is a fire hazard because of the wool." Eulah felt the ground shift beneath her. She had prepared herself for mockery. She had endured Ludlow's lectures and Whitmore's theology and the newspaper article, and Emery's contempt. But she had not prepared for this. Dunbar was not just a man with an opinion. Dunbar was the largest rancher in the basin, with connections to the territorial legislature and the cattle associations in Cheyenne. And if he decided to make Eulah's barn a political matter, he had the power to do it. "Could you speak for me?" she asked. "Before the council, you understand the principles." Pemberton shook his head slowly. "My words carry no weight before a council of white men, Mrs. Treadwell. You know that." They stood together in the cold sunshine, and neither of them spoke for a while. There was nothing to say. They both lived in a territory where the people who understood things best were the people least likely to be heard. That evening, Eulah wrote in her ledger, "If the winter is mild, Dunbar will destroy me. If the winter is severe, Dunbar will lose his cattle. I do not want either of those things, but I do not get to choose." The temperature dropped steadily through December. Eulah recorded her numbers 4 times a day, and the wool walls held their differential with the consistency of a mathematical law. But outside the barn, the Powder River country was beginning to break. Hollis Ludlow rode into Crooked Creek in mid-December with a face that had aged 5 years since September. He reported to the men gathered at the mercantile that he had already lost 40 head, mostly young calves and older cows that lacked the body reserves to survive the persistent cold. The cattle were not freezing to death outright. They were starving. The deep frost had locked the prairie grass under a crust of ice that the animals could not break through, and Ludlow had not stored nearly enough hay to feed 400 head through what was clearly going to be an unusually long winter. The cattle were burning through their own fat to fuel their own metabolism, and when the fat was gone, they would simply lie down in the snow and not stand up again. By Christmas, Ludlow had lost 75 head. Rowan Dunbar's situation was worse. He had 4,000 cattle on the open range and enough hay for emergency feeding of only his most valuable breeding stock. His foreman rode out daily through December, trying to push the herds toward areas where the snow was thinner, but the work of moving weakened cattle through deep snow burned the very energy the animals needed to survive. By the 1st of January, Dunbar had lost an estimated 400 head, and the temperature had fallen to 32 below, with no sign of warming. Eulah heard about these losses at the Saturday gatherings at the Crooked Creek Mercantile, where ranchers came to buy supplies and share information in voices that grew quieter and more strained with each passing week. She did not comment. She listened, made her purchases, and drove her wagon back to the barn, where her own animals were thriving in conditions the outside world could not touch. It was on one of these Saturday trips in the second week of December that Emery encountered Ludlow at the mercantile. The store was crowded. A dozen ranchers and their hands stood around the stove, warming themselves and exchanging casualty reports in the flat, matter-of-fact tone that men use when they are describing losses they cannot afford and do not want to feel. Ludlow saw Emery across the room and called out in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "Boy, those sheep your stepmother keeps in that wool box of hers, they alive still, or did they suffocate in all that fleece?" A few men laughed. Emery stood near the dry goods counter with his hands in his pockets and looked at Ludlow across the crowded room. 3 months ago, he would have burned with shame. 3 months ago, he would have mumbled something agreeable and looked at the floor and wished he belonged to any family other than the one he had been given. But 3 months ago, he had not spent 60 consecutive nights inside a barn where the temperature never dropped below 28 degrees, while the world outside fell to 20 and 30 and 40 below. 3 months ago, he had not watched newborn lambs stand up and nurse in the warmth of a structure that every man in this room had called worthless. "Her animals are not dying," Emery said. His voice was quiet, but it carried. Yours are. The laughter stopped. The room went still. Ludlow's face reddened and his jaw worked as if he were chewing something he could not swallow. Several of the men looked at Emery with the startled respect that people give to a boy who has said something true that no adult in the room was willing to say. Eulah was standing behind the counter near the canned goods. She heard every word. Her hands trembled, though not from cold. No one spoke for several seconds. Then the conversations resumed quieter than before, and Emery walked out of the mercantile without looking at anyone. Eulah followed him a few minutes later and found him sitting in the wagon with his collar turned up against the wind, staring at the horizon. She climbed up beside him and took the reins. They drove home in silence for the first mile. The runners of the wagon hissed through the crusted snow, and the mule leaned into its traces with the patient resignation of an animal that has accepted the world's terms. Somewhere past the halfway point, Emery spoke without turning his head. I did not say it for you. Eulah kept her eyes on the trail. I know. I said it because it was true. Their animals are dying and yours are not. That is a fact. It is not loyalty. It is arithmetic. I know that too, Eulah said. Emery was quiet for another quarter mile. Then he said, still facing the horizon, but if it had not been true, I would not have said it. Eulah understood what he was telling her. He was not declaring himself her ally. He was not surrendering the resentment he carried for reasons that had nothing to do with wool or barns or winter. He was simply acknowledging that the evidence had become too heavy to carry in the other direction, and that a boy raised in a church school in Minnesota could not stand in a room full of men and allow a lie to go unchallenged when the truth was sleeping warm and alive 3 miles away in a barn that every person in that room had mocked. She did not thank him. He did not explain further. But something had shifted between them that was as measurable as the temperature differential in the barn, and both of them knew it. The great disaster arrived in 2 stages. The first stage began on the 8th of January, when an Arctic air mass settled over the northern plains with the finality of a door being closed. The temperature at Crooked Creek dropped to 44 below zero by sunrise on the 9th, and it did not recover. Day after day, the thermometers across the territory recorded readings between 30 and 52 below, with the lowest temperatures occurring on still windless nights when the sky was clear and the stars burned with a brightness that seemed to come from the cold itself. Eulah descended from the loft on the morning of January 11th and made her readings. Outside 48 below zero, inside 26 above. She stared at the numbers for a long time. 74 degrees. She wrote them in the ledger and underlined the number 3 times. Beneath it, she wrote 2 words, grandmother. That was all. The water trough showed no ice. The animals ate their hay and lay in their straw and breathed the still warm air as if winter were something happening to other creatures in another country. Outside, the cold was killing on a scale that no one living had ever witnessed. In the 3rd week of January, with the outside temperature still near 40, below the first ewe went into labor. Eulah had been watching her for 2 days. The animal was restless, pawing at her straw, separating herself from the flock, the way ewes do when their time is close. Emery noticed it on the morning of the 21st and asked Eulah what was happening. She told him. He looked at the ewe and then at the barn door, beyond which the temperature was cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in less than a minute. If she were outside, he said, it was not a question. The lambs would be dead within an hour, Eulah said. Newborns cannot regulate their own body temperature for the first several days. Below 20 degrees, they freeze. It does not matter how close the mother holds them. The ewe delivered twin lambs late that afternoon in the warm straw of the lambing pen, with Eulah's hands guiding the second one when it came breech. Emery stood behind her holding the lantern, his face pale but his hands steady, watching the wet, steaming shapes emerge into the warm air and begin immediately to move. The first lamb stood up within 30 minutes. The second took nearly an hour wobbling on legs that seemed too long for its body, but it found the teat and began to nurse, and both lambs lived through the night and through the next night and through every night that followed. Emery set the lantern down and sat on an overturned bucket and watched the lambs pressed against their mother's flank. Outside, the temperature was 41 below zero. Inside, it was 30 degrees above. The lambs were breathing. Their small sides rose and fell with the rhythm of creatures who had entered the world in a place that was warm enough to receive them. "Your grandmother," Emery said quietly. "She was right." Eulah nodded. "She was always right." She did not say more than that. The moment did not require more. A boy who had spent 5 months refusing to acknowledge what was in front of him had finally seen it, and the seeing had not come through argument or explanation, but through the simple act of watching two lives begin in a space that should not have been warm enough to sustain them, but was. 4 miles to the north, the cattle of the Powder River Land and Cattle Company were dying in numbers that would eventually require more than 50 men working through the spring just to count and burn the remains. The second stage of the disaster began on the 25th of January when snow started falling and did not stop for 16 days. It came in heavy, wet flakes on the first day, then in dry powder driven by winds that gusted past 60 miles an hour, then in fine granular crystals that filled every depression and buried every fence post and transformed the prairie into an unbroken white surface as hard as a tabletop. Drifts reached 15 feet against any vertical obstruction. Cattle that had been weakened by 3 weeks of extreme cold now found themselves unable to reach any food at all. Hay supplies that had been carefully rationed through December were exhausted. There was no neighbor to borrow from, no railroad that could ship feed fast enough, no government program to provide relief. The cattle began to die in numbers that would not be fully comprehended until spring. Hollis Ludlow rode up to Eulah's gate on the 8th of February. His horse picked its way through drifts that came to its chest, and the man himself looked as if he had not slept in 2 weeks. His cheeks were hollow. His eyes were red-rimmed and raw. He sat on his exhausted horse at the gate and called out to Eulah, and when she came out of the barn, he began to speak in a voice that broke twice before he finished. "Mrs. Treadwell, I have lost more than half my herd. The ones that are left, maybe 60 head, are at the line shack I built last summer, and they are dying because the wind comes straight through the cottonwood walls. I have heard that your animals are alive, that your barn keeps them warm." He stopped. He swallowed several times. He looked at the snow and then at her face and then at the snow again. "I have come to ask if I could bring some of my breeding cows here, just the best ones, just the ones we need to start again in the spring. I will pay whatever you ask, but I cannot watch them die, Mrs. Treadwell. I cannot watch any more of them die." Eulah looked at this man who had sat on his horse in July and lectured her about wool being money. This man who had taken Emery under his wing and filled the boy's head with the certainty that real ranchers did not need walls. This man whose voice was now breaking like creek ice in the spring, whose eyes were wet, whose hands on the reins were trembling. She felt no satisfaction. She searched for it and found nothing. Only a deep and unfamiliar sadness for the animals that had died because their owner had been too certain of his own knowledge to consider that someone else might know something he did not. Behind her, Emery appeared in the barn door. He looked at Ludlow. He saw the man who had given him a cowboy hat and taught him to count cattle and called his stepmother's work a joke. He saw that man sitting on a spent horse begging. Emery stepped forward. "She will take your cattle," he said. "I will clear the hay storage at the south end tonight." Eulah looked at him. She did not thank him. She nodded. Bring them tomorrow, she said to Ludlow. As many as you can move through the snow. I will have a place ready. 23 cows arrived the next afternoon. Ludlow and 3 of his remaining hands had worked through the night to break a trail through the drifts. 2 animals died on the way and were left where they fell. The surviving 23 were moved into the south end of the barn, into the area Emery had spent the night clearing. When the doors closed behind them and the wool gaskets sealed against the frames, the cattle stood for a long time in the unfamiliar warmth, breathing slowly, swaying on legs that had carried them 4 miles through chest-deep snow. Within an hour, 2 had lain down. Within 3 hours, all 23 were either resting in the straw or eating from the hay racks Eulah had filled. The temperature in that section rose as the additional body heat joined the existing warmth, and the wool walls absorbed it and held it the way they held everything quietly and completely. What followed was a week that Eulah would remember for the rest of her life, not for its hardship, but for its strange and unexpected grace. Colton Kershaw arrived on the 11th with his family's milk cow and his daughter's pony. Both animals thin and shaking, and Eulah took them in without hesitation. On the 13th, Dalton Stannard appeared, a Basque sheep herder of about 55, whose original flock of 200 had been reduced to 35. He brought his survivors to Eulah's barn and asked permission to sleep in the tack room, and she agreed, and Stannard proved to be a calm and skilled hand with the lambing that was now occurring regularly. On the 14th of February, Reverend Orrin Whitmore rode up to the gate, and Eulah felt something tighten in her chest. But Whitmore had not come about livestock. Behind him, walking through the broken trail, were 2 families from Crooked Creek, a carpenter named Briggs and a blacksmith named Hadley, both of whom had lost every animal they owned and were now running out of firewood in their cabins. Whitmore dismounted and stood at the gate with his hat in his hands, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the assured authority it had held in August. "Mrs. Treadwell, I know that I have no right to ask you anything. I said things to you last summer that I should not have said, but these 2 families are in danger of freezing in their own homes. Your barn is warmer than any structure within 50 miles, and I am asking you to shelter these people until the weather breaks." Eulah looked at him. She looked at the 2 families standing behind him in the snow, the children bundled in every piece of clothing their parents owned, their faces red and frightened. She looked at Whitmore, the man who had told her that protecting her animals with wool was a failure of faith. "Bring them in," she said. Whitmore's shoulders dropped, his chin lowered. It was not quite a bow, but it was close. "I will not forget this," he said. "I will not forget either, Reverend," Eulah said, "but not for the reason you think." Rowan Dunbar came on the 15th. The scene at the gate was the one described at the opening of this story, except that now it carried the weight of everything that had happened in the 5 months between his September visit and this February afternoon. He stood at the gate with his last 8 breeding bulls, and he could not speak, and Eulah opened the gate without requiring him to. As Dunbar led his bulls through the yard, he passed Emery, who was shoveling a path between the barn and the well. Dunbar looked at the boy. "Your stepmother," he started to say and then stopped. "She told you in the September," Emery said. "You called it a coffin." Dunbar nodded once slowly and walked his bulls into the barn without turning around. By the 3rd week of February, Eulah Treadwell was sheltering her own 40 sheep, her 2 milk cows, her mule, her chickens, 23 of Ludlow's breeding cows, the Kershaw family's milk cow and pony, 35 of Stannard's surviving sheep, 8 of Dunbar's breeding bulls, 2 displaced families, and a Basque sheep herder who slept in the tack room and sang quietly to the ewes during lambing. The total population of the wool barn was nearly 120 animals and 11 human beings. The temperature inside held at 45 degrees during the day and 40 at night. Not a single animal that crossed Eulah's threshold died inside her walls. The barn that had been called a coffin for sheep had become a refuge for the surviving stock of 3 ranches and a herder, and the only reason it could perform this function was that a woman had spent the previous summer doing exactly what every neighbor had told her not to do. Late one night, after the families had settled onto pallets in the loft, and Stannard had finished his rounds with the ewes, and Emery had fallen asleep with his ledger open on his chest, Eulah stood alone in the center of the stable. She looked at the sleeping animals and the sleeping people and the wool walls that held them all in warmth while the territory outside died. She opened her ledger to a fresh page and wrote what would be the last entry of that winter. "Grandmother, you said wool holds warmth where warmth has no right to exist. But you forgot to tell me that warmth is not only temperature." She closed the book. Above her, the wind pressed against the roof and the wool pressed back, and inside that 8-inch margin of trapped air, more than 100 lives continued breathing through the worst winter the American West had ever seen. The Chinook came on the 17th of February like a pardon from a governor nobody had petitioned. A warm wind poured down from the Bighorn Mountains and swept across the frozen prairie, and the temperature rose 30 degrees in 6 hours. The snow did not melt, not in any meaningful sense, but it settled and crusted over, compacting under its own weight until the surface was hard enough to support a horse. The sky, which had been a low gray ceiling for weeks, broke open into pale blue, and for the first time since early January, the sun had enough strength to cast shadows. Eulah stood outside the barn that morning and watched the light change. The air was still cold, still well below freezing, but it had lost the killing edge that had defined every breath for 6 weeks. She could feel the difference on her skin. The cold was retreating, pulling back toward Canada like an army that has done its damage and sees no reason to stay. Inside the barn, the animals stirred. The cattle shifted in their straw. The sheep moved toward the door, sensing something in the air that meant the world outside was no longer trying to kill them. Stannard came out of the tack room, rubbing his eyes, and stood beside Eulah, and for a minute neither of them spoke. Then Stannard looked at the sky and crossed himself and said something in Basque that Eulah did not understand, but that sounded very much like a prayer. The 2 families Whitmore had brought sheltered out of the barn that same day, walking back toward Crooked Creek on the crusted snow, with their children wrapped in blankets that Eulah had given them. The carpenter Briggs shook Eulah's hand at the gate. The blacksmith Hadley could not speak at all. He simply touched his hat and walked away with his wife and his 2 boys, and Eulah watched them grow small against the white landscape and thought about how strange it was that these people had spent 2 weeks in her barn without ever asking her a single question about how the walls were built. The work of assessing what the winter had done began almost immediately, and the numbers when they came were beyond anything that anyone had imagined. Rowan Dunbar had lost 92% of his herd. Of 4,000 cattle on the range in October, fewer than 320 were alive in March. Hollis Ludlow had lost 87%. The Powder River Land and Cattle Company, the second largest outfit in the basin, had lost 95% of its stock. Across the territory from southern Montana to eastern Nebraska to central Wyoming to western Dakota, total cattle losses ran between 60 and 90% depending on the location and the management practices of individual ranchers. The best estimates put the number of cattle killed by the winter of 1886 to 1887 at well over 1.5 million animals. The financial losses ran into the tens of millions of dollars. Banks that had lent money against cattle that no longer existed failed in chains across 3 territories. Eastern investors who had funded the great ranching enterprises pulled their capital out of the West and refused to return. The open-range cattle industry that had defined the Western economy for 15 years collapsed in a single season. Ranchers who had been wealthy in October were bankrupt by March. And the lesson that emerged from the disaster slowly at first, and then with the clarity of a bell struck in an empty church, was that the assumption underlying the entire system, the assumption that cattle were tough enough to survive without shelter, had been catastrophically wrong. The cattle had not been tough enough. They had only been lucky, and the luck had run out in January of 1887 and would never come back. Eulah Treadwell returned everyone's animals in the first week of March. She did it methodically, one herd at a time, with the quiet efficiency of a woman who understood that the most important thing she could do now was let people rebuild without making them feel small. Hollis Ludlow came first. He arrived on a Tuesday morning with 3 of his hands in a string of lead ropes, and he stood at the gate in the place where he had sat his horse 9 months earlier and told Eulah that wool was money and mice would nest in it by Christmas. The 23 breeding cows were alive, every one of them. They walked out of the barn on legs that had strengthened during 3 weeks of regular hay in a heated structure, and they moved with the easy gait of animals that had not been asked to survive on grit and grass in the good Lord's mercy, but had instead been given walls and warmth and the chance to eat without freezing. Ludlow watched his cows file through the gate, and then he took off his hat and held it against his chest and spoke in a voice that carried no bluster, no authority, no trace of the man who had appointed himself spokesman for proper ranching practice. "Mrs. Treadwell, I owe you more than money. I owe you an apology in front of anyone who will listen. You were right, and I was wrong, and my being wrong killed 340 cattle that would still be alive if I had listened to you last summer." Eulah looked at him. She saw a man who had been broken and was trying to reassemble himself into something better than what he had been, and she recognized the effort because she had done it herself after Anders died. "You were not wrong because you did not know Mr. Ludlow," she said. "You were wrong because you did not ask." Ludlow put his hat back on and nodded once and gathered his cows and drove them north toward what was left of his ranch. He would rebuild a smaller operation, never more than 200 head, and he would insulate every structure on his property with wool batting for the rest of his life. He lived until 1908, and he was known in the Powder River country for referring to Eulah Treadwell as the woman who taught me what I should have known. Dalton Stannard left on the same day. His 35 surviving sheep were gathered in the yard bleeding in the March sunshine, and Stannard stood beside them with his bedroll over his shoulder and his rifle in his hand, and he looked at Eulah with an expression that combined gratitude and grief in a mixture that words could not have sorted out, even if both of them had spoken the same language fluently. He had lost 165 animals, more than 80% of his flock. The sheep that remained were the ones he had brought to Eulah's barn, and they were alive because of a decision he had almost not made. He told Eulah later, through a combination of broken English and hand gestures, that he had nearly turned back twice on the walk to her place. The snow had been waist deep. 3 of the weakest ewes had collapsed in the first mile, and he had carried them one at a time, draped across his shoulders, the way his father had carried injured lambs in the mountains above Bilbao. By the time he reached Eulah's gate on the 13th of February, his hands were white and his feet had lost feeling, and he could not speak at all. Emery had seen him coming through the window and had run out to open the gate and help carry the last ewe inside. Now in the March sunshine, Stannard reached into his coat and brought out a pair of shearing scissors made of Toledo steel that had been in his family for 30 years. The handles were worn smooth from decades of use. The blades still held an edge that could separate fleece from skin in a single pass. He held them out to Eulah. "You saved my flock," he said. "This is the most valuable thing I own." Eulah took the scissors. They were heavy and warm from his body heat, and she held them in both hands and could not speak for several seconds. She understood what this gift meant. These were not merely tools. They were the continuation of a family's livelihood passed from father to son across generations in a country Stannard would never see again, and he was giving them to a woman he had known for less than a month because that woman had done something that no one else in the territory had been willing to do. Stannard embraced her, the brief and fierce embrace of a man who does not embrace people often, and then he gathered his sheep and walked south along the creek toward his own claim. Eulah watched him go and held the Toledo scissors and understood that she had just been given something that had nothing to do with cutting wool. She kept those scissors for the rest of her life. They hung on a nail beside the barn door, and she used them every shearing season, and every time she picked them up, she thought of the Basque man who had carried 3 dying ewes through the snow on his shoulders rather than leave them behind. Rowan Dunbar collected his 8 bulls on a cold morning near the end of the first week. He did not apologize. Eulah had not expected him to. Some men do not have that capacity, and Dunbar was one of them. The pride that had built a 4,000-head empire was the same pride that prevented him from saying the words that Ludlow had been able to say, and Eulah understood this the way she understood weather. It was a condition, not a choice. But as he led the bulls through the gate, Dunbar stopped. He stood with his back to Eulah and his face toward the open range where his cattle had died by the thousands, and he said without turning around, "I called this place a coffin. It was the only thing left alive." Then he walked on, and those were the last words he ever spoke to her. Eulah learned the rest of Dunbar's story in pieces over the years that followed. He never recovered financially from the disaster. He sold his rangeland to pay his creditors and spent his remaining years working as a clerk in the Cheyenne stockyards, the very yards where he had once been one of the largest consignors. He died in 1894 in a hotel room in Cheyenne alone, and the last thing he was known to have said to anyone was spoken to a fellow clerk at the shipping desk on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. "I had 4,000 cattle and not one wall," Dunbar said. "Now I have walls all around me and not one cow." The man who heard this did not understand what it meant. But Eulah would have understood, and Ludlow would have understood, and Josias Pemberton would have understood, because all of them had lived through the same winter and had emerged on the other side, knowing the same thing, that the line between prosperity and ruin was exactly 8 inches of raw wool, and that the people who had put it there were the people the world had laughed at. Colton Kershaw came for his milk cow and his daughter's pony on a bright afternoon, and he paid for their 3 weeks of shelter with a generous side of beef from one of the few cattle his family had managed to save. His daughter, a girl of 9 named Greer, led the pony out of the barn and then ran back inside and threw her arms around Eulah's waist and stood there for a long time without saying anything. Eulah had sewn a small wool blanket for the child during the long February nights, and she draped it over Greer's shoulders and watched the girl walk away with her pony and her blanket. And she thought about the grandmother who had taught her to make felt, and the grandchildren she did not yet have, and the unbroken line of hands teaching other hands that stretched from the Finnmark Plateau to the Powder River and would stretch further still. Tansy Renfield arrived in April when the last of the snow was retreating into the coulees, and the first green shoots of spring grass were pushing through the brown stubble of the prairie. She came alone on horseback, carrying a leather satchel that contained a manuscript she had been working on since March. "Mrs. Treadwell," she said, "I wrote the first article the way my editor wanted. This one I wrote the way I wanted. If he will not publish it, I will send it to every newspaper between here and Chicago. She handed Eulah the manuscript. It was 12 pages long, written in a clear, precise hand, and it was nothing like the first article. It described the construction of the wool barn in technical detail. It reported the temperature differentials Eulah had recorded throughout the winter. It documented the survival of every animal sheltered within the walls and contrasted that survival with the catastrophic losses on the open range. It named names. It quoted Ludlow's July pronouncement about mice and Christmas. It quoted Dunbar's September assessment about coffins and sheep. And it concluded with a statement that Tansey had written and rewritten 6 times before she was satisfied that the conventional wisdom of the open-range cattle industry had been proven wrong by the worst winter in the memory of the American West, and that the correction had come from a Norwegian immigrant widow whose methods had been mock-dismissed and publicly ridiculed by every man who later came to her door begging for help. Eulah read the manuscript standing in the yard. She corrected 2 technical details about the floor assembly and one about the ridge ventilation, and then she looked up and said, "Did you talk to Josias Pemberton? He understands the principles from his own people. His grandmother's people built shelters using the same ideas long before any white settler set foot on these plains. You should include that." Tansey nodded. "I will go see him this week." The article encountered resistance. Tansey's editor at the Cheyenne Tribune did not want to publish a piece that effectively told his readers they had been fools. "People do not want to read that they were wrong," he said. "1.5 million cattle are dead," Tansey said. "They already know they were wrong. What they do not know is what to do differently, and this article tells them." The piece ran in the summer of 1888 under a headline that was considerably less entertaining than Norwegian widow-built sheep hotel. It was not read as widely as the original article because corrections never are. But it was the first time a major territorial newspaper had publicly acknowledged that the cattle industry's foundational assumption had been wrong and that the corrective had come from a woman the paper itself had helped to ridicule. Reverend Whitmore preached a sermon on Easter Sunday of 1887 that divided his congregation down the middle. He stood at the pulpit in the small frame church in Crooked Creek and spoke for nearly 40 minutes, and the core of what he said was this, that the previous summer he had told a woman she lacked faith in the Almighty because she had chosen to protect her livestock with wool insulation, and that the winter had demonstrated with a finality that left no room for debate that the Almighty had given humanity wool precisely so that it could be used in exactly the way that woman had used it. The arrogance, Whitmore said, was not in protecting animals from cold. The arrogance was in believing that you knew the mind of God when what you actually knew was only your own habits. He paused after saying this, and the silence in the church was of a kind that congregations produce only when a minister has said something they were not prepared to hear. A rancher in the third pew crossed his arms. The woman beside him wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. In the back row, one of Dunbar's former foremen stood up and walked out without closing the door behind him, and the April wind came through the opening and moved the pages of the hymnals on the pew racks. Whitmore continued. He said that the winter had taught him something about the difference between faith and assumption. Faith, he said, was trusting that God had provided the materials and the knowledge to survive. Assumption was believing that survival required no effort on your part because God would handle the details. He had confused the two, and the confusion had cost animals their lives and families their futures, and he would carry that confusion as a burden for the rest of his ministry. Half the congregation nodded. The other half looked at the floor. Linnea Brogan, sitting near the front with Colton and their daughter, reached across the pew and took her husband's hand. Colton looked at her and then at the pulpit and then at his hands, and he was one of the men who nodded. Whitmore never became a close friend of Eulah's, but he never repeated the mistake. And in the years that followed, he was occasionally heard to tell people who were new to the territory that if they wanted to understand how to build for the Wyoming winter, they should ride out to the Treadwell place and ask the woman there to show them. He kept a small piece of raw fleece on his desk in the parsonage for the rest of his career. When visitors asked about it, he told them it was a reminder of a lesson he had learned the hard way. The method spread. By the autumn of 1887, Ludlow had built a wool-insulated barn on his rebuilt property, copying Eulah's basic design but scaling it up for cattle. He hired 2 men from the territory and paid Eulah to supervise the construction. She stood in his yard on a September morning and watched the men frame the double walls, and when they began packing the wool into the cavity, she walked the line and checked every section with her hand pressing and releasing the way her grandmother had taught her. One section near the northwest corner was packed too tight. She pulled out a double handful and repacked it looser, and Ludlow watched her do it and said nothing, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who is watching competence so thorough that it becomes a kind of art. Dunbar, before his financial collapse, became total commission 2 such structures on the central section of his ranch, and hired a Norwegian carpenter from Casper, who had studied Eulah's original construction. The carpenter rode out to the Treadwell place 3 times to take measurements and ask questions, and Eulah answered every one of them with the patient thoroughness of a woman who understood that every barn built correctly was a barn that would save animals in the next hard winter. She did not charge the carpenter for her time. She did not charge anyone who came to learn. The knowledge was not hers to sell. It belonged to her grandmother and to her grandmother's grandmother and to the centuries of cold that had refined it. Linnea Brogan convinced Colton to retrofit their existing log barn with wool batting in the walls and felt gaskets on the doors. Colton resisted at first. He had not lost as many cattle as Ludlow or Dunbar, and the cost of purchasing enough fleece to fill an existing structure was not small. But Linnea had spent 2 weeks inside Eulah's barn during the worst of the storm, and she had felt the warmth of those walls, and she told Colton in plain language that she would not spend another winter listening to their animals suffer when the solution was available for 3 cents a pound. They completed the retrofit in October, and the family reported significantly reduced feed requirements the following winter. Their cattle gained weight through January for the first time in 9 years of ranching. By 1888, articles about wool insulation had appeared in agricultural publications across the East. The Prairie Farmer, the Breeder's Gazette, and the Rocky Mountain Husbandman all ran pieces describing the technique and recommending it, and the writers treated it not as the eccentric folly of a foreign widow, but as proven practice, validated by disaster, and recommended by the surviving ranchers of the Powder River Basin. A professor of agricultural science at the University of Nebraska wrote to Eulah requesting detailed specifications, and she sent him a 4-page letter in her careful English that described every measurement, every material, every principle she had learned from her grandmother. The professor published the letter in full in his department's bulletin with a note that read, "The following was received from a practical builder in Wyoming whose experience during the great die-up of 1886-87 constitutes the most convincing evidence available for the superiority of natural fiber insulation in agricultural structures." Josias Pemberton became an informal consultant on the design work. He understood the underlying principles more intuitively than most of the white ranchers who were adopting them, because his own people had carried the same knowledge for generations before anyone in the territory had thought to ask them. He and Eulah collaborated on several construction projects over the next few years, and their partnership was unusual enough to attract comment. A Cheyenne man and a Norwegian woman working together on barns in the Powder River country. People talked. Eulah did not care. Pemberton did not care. They shared a language that had nothing to do with words and everything to do with the way a wall should feel when you pressed your hand against it. Their friendship, which had begun with his quiet recognition of her work in September of 1886, continued through the seasons and the years with the steady, undemonstrative warmth of two people who did not need to explain themselves to each other. Pemberton brought his children to the barn every spring, and Eulah taught them to felt wool the way her grandmother had taught her pressing and wetting and pressing again until the fibers locked together into a dense waterproof fabric that could be cut into gaskets and seals. His youngest daughter became so skilled at felting that she eventually supplied door and window gaskets to half the ranches in the basin. Pemberton died in 1903 quietly on his own land with his wife and his children around him. Eulah named her youngest son Josias. Emery's letter arrived from Minnesota in the spring of 1887, written in his grandfather's trembling hand. The old man wanted the boy back. The obligation to the stepmother had been fulfilled, the letter said. The boy had endured enough. It was time for him to come home to people who shared his blood. Emery read the letter at the kitchen table in Eulah's cabin. He read it twice. Then he folded it and placed it on the table and slid it across to Eulah, who read it once and set it down and waited. "I'm going to write back," Emery said. "I'm going to tell them I am staying." Eulah looked at him across the table. The boy who had arrived on a freight wagon 8 months ago, thin and silent and determined to keep her at the distance a wall provides. The boy who had called her Mrs. Treadwell and refused to touch the wooden paddle and ridden off to Ludlow's ranch every morning as if he could escape her by putting miles between them. That boy was still there. She could see him in the set of Emery's jaw and the careful way he held himself as if showing too much feeling would cost him something he could not afford. But there was something else there now layered over the stubbornness, and it had the quality of a decision made not in a single moment, but across many moments, accumulated like temperature readings in a ledger until the pattern was unmistakable. "Why?" Eulah asked. Emery was quiet for a while. He looked at his hands on the table, the hands that had held a lantern, while twin lambs were born in a blizzard, the hands that had written temperature readings 4 times a day for 3 months, the hands that had shoveled the south end of the barn clear on the night Hollis Ludlow came begging. "Because my father would have wanted me to learn from someone who knows how to keep things alive," he said. Eulah did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she had used up most of a year's worth of tears on that September evening by the creek when Emery had spoken with Anders' voice and Anders' cruelty. But she felt something settle in her chest, something that had been floating loose since the day she left Minnesota, and it settled the way wool settles into a wall cavity when the density is right, firmly, completely, with no intention of moving again. "There is a loft extension that needs building," she said. "We can start this afternoon." Emery stayed in Wyoming. He learned to build insulated barns, and he learned to lamb in winter, and he learned to read weather from the way the wind moved the grass in autumn. He grew into a tall, quiet man with his father's jaw and his stepmother's patience, and he married the daughter of a rancher from the Tongue River country in 1894 and built his own homestead 12 miles east of Eulah's place. The barn he built for himself was the finest wool-insulated structure in the territory. He spent 3 months on the wall cavity alone, packing and testing and repacking, until every section met the standard Eulah had taught him. When he finished, he brought Eulah out to inspect it. She walked the perimeter, slowly pressing her hand against each section of the interior wall. At the end, she turned to him and nodded once. "Your grandmother would approve," she said. It was the highest praise she knew how to give, and Emery understood that. In the years that followed, he became the most effective advocate for Eulah's methods in the territory, not because he had technical expertise that others lacked, but because he could tell the story in a way that reached men who were too proud to learn from a woman. "I am the one who laughed at her," he would say to ranchers who came to see the barn. "I lived in the same house, and I thought she was wrong. Then I spent a winter inside those walls, while 1.5 million cattle froze to death on the open range, and I watched lambs born in 40 below zero stand up and nurse in air that was warm enough to keep them alive. If I can change my mind, so can you." He said this dozens of times over the years to dozens of men, and the words never changed because they did not need to change. The truth does not require variation. It only requires repetition, and Emery understood this the way Eulah understood wool, completely, without needing to explain it. Eulah Treadwell married again in 1892. Arden Ansley was a German blacksmith who had settled in Crooked Creek 2 years earlier, a quiet man with strong hands and no opinions about how other people should build their barns. He had come to Wyoming from Pennsylvania, where his father had worked in the iron foundries of Pittsburgh, and he carried with him the particular humility of a man who has seen industry up close and understands that the people who build things are rarely the people who receive credit for them. He saw Eulah's barn and her flock and her reputation, and he did not try to improve any of them. He built her a forge and an addition to her cabin and respected her livestock methods completely. On their wedding day, he gave her a wool comb he had forged himself from the best steel he could find, and Eulah held it in her hands and felt the weight and the balance and knew that this man understood her in the way that mattered most. They raised 3 children together, all of whom learned to pack wool into wall cavities by the time they could swing a paddle, and all of whom grew up to become competent ranchers. The oldest, a boy they named Anders, after Eulah's first husband, showed a particular gift for construction and eventually built insulated barns as far away as Montana and the Dakotas. The middle child, a girl named Marin after Eulah's grandmother, became a teacher at the Crooked Creek School and taught a generation of children the basic principles of insulation as part of her science curriculum. The youngest was Josias, named for the Cheyenne man whose friendship had sustained Eulah through the worst year of her life. She kept the original wool barn in service for 30 years. She replaced the outer sheathing twice and topped up the wall cavity with fresh fleece every 5 years, but the basic structure never needed rebuilding. Visitors came from across the territory and eventually from across the region to see it. Agricultural agents, university professors, ranchers from Montana and the Dakotas and Eastern Oregon, all of them walking through the same barn door and pressing their hands against the same walls and feeling the same gentle warmth that Eulah's grandmother had felt inside the Gamo on the Finnmark Plateau half a century and half a world away. Eulah showed each of them the construction. She explained the principles once clearly in the same words she had used since 1886, and she let them touch the walls and draw their own conclusions. She never argued with skeptics. She never defended her methods to anyone who did not want to learn. She had spent enough of her life arguing with men who were not listening. The barn outlasted her. It was still standing in 1936 when her youngest daughter sold the ranch and moved to Casper, and a photograph of it appeared that year in a Wyoming Agricultural Extension bulletin as an example of pioneer engineering that was still serving its original purpose half a century after construction. Eulah Treadwell Ansley died in 1918 at the age of 66. She was buried on a small rise overlooking the creek near the foundations of the sod dugout, where she had spent her first summer in the territory. Her grave marker carved by Arden from a piece of bighorn limestone read, Eulah Treadwell Ansley, 1852 to 1918. Mother, builder, friend to cold weather animals. When a young agricultural extension agent visited her ranch in her final years and asked her to summarize what she had learned from her experience, she gave an answer that was brief and plain and true. The cold does not care about your opinions, she said. It only cares about your physics. If your physics are wrong, your animals die. If your physics are right, your animals live. My physics were right because my grandmother taught me and her grandmother taught her. And someone many generations ago figured out that wool holds still air and still air holds heat, and a wall full of still air between you and a Wyoming winter is the difference between a herd in the spring and an empty pasture full of carcasses. The barn was torn down in 1942. A new owner wanted the space for a tractor shed, and the old structure, remarkable as it was, stood in the way of progress. The men who did the demolition pried off the outer sheathing and found the wool, more than 1,000 pounds of it packed into the wall cavities 56 years earlier by a woman with a flat wooden paddle and a grandmother's knowledge. The fleece was still soft, still pliable, still carrying faintly but unmistakably the smell of lanolin. 56 years in the dark, and the wool had not rotted, had not powdered, had not lost the quality that had made it miraculous in the first place. The demolition crew carried armloads of it home as souvenirs, and small pieces of that original fleece were passed from hand to hand in Powder River households for the next 30 years, kept in glass jars on mantelpieces, brought out on winter evenings to show to visitors, and every time someone held a piece of that wool and turned it in the light and smelled the faint ghost of sheep and lanolin, they were told the story. About the Norwegian widow who came to Wyoming with a wool comb and a satchel of seeds. About the barn that every rancher in the territory had called a coffin for sheep. About the winter that killed 1.5 million cattle and bankrupted half the territory. About the walls that held and the animals that lived, and the woman who had known all along what it would take to survive because her grandmother had taught her, and her grandmother's grandmother had taught her, and somewhere far back in the cold centuries of the Finnmark Plateau, someone had placed a hand against a wall of raw wool and felt it yield gently under the pressure and spring back when the hand was removed, and had understood that this was enough, that this had always been enough, that the physics were right and the cold did not care about opinions and the wool would hold.